300,000 years ago, 9 species of humans walked this planet. Every one of them had a brain. Every one of them had fire. Every one of them had tools, social bonds, the ability to survive conditions that would have killed any other animal. 8 of the 9 disappeared. 1 remained. And that one is you. The question is not who the other 8 were. The question is why you, and not them. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel. Your support makes this work possible, and it genuinely matters. Thank you. Now, let us be precise about what we mean when we say 9 species of humans. We are not talking about 9 races. We are not talking about 9 cultures. We are talking about 9 genuinely distinct biological species. Animals as different from each other, in some cases, as a wolf is from a coyote or a lion from a leopard. Animals that could, in some combinations, interbreed, and did, but that had been separated by geography, climate, and millions of years of independent evolution into forms recognizably different in skull shape, body proportion, brain size, and behavior. 9 experiments in being human, running simultaneously on the same planet, competing for the same resources, hunting the same prey, sheltering in the same caves. For the last 40,000 years, we have been alone. 1 species, 1 planet, a monopoly so complete that we have forgotten it was ever otherwise. But go back just a little further. A geological eye blink, 300,000 years, and the picture is unrecognizable. The world was crowded with us, multiple versions of us, competing versions, and the outcome that produced the world you are sitting in right now was not inevitable. It was contingent. It was close. And understanding exactly how close it was requires understanding who the losers were. Let us start at the beginning. Not with Homo sapiens. We come to ourselves last, because that is where the story ends, not where it begins. Let us start 2.5 million years ago in Eastern Africa with the animal that first earned the name Homo, Homo habilis, the handyman, named not for any particular physical characteristic, but for what it was found doing, or more precisely, for what it was found near. In 1960, a team of researchers led by Louis and Mary Leakey excavated fossilized remains in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, alongside thousands of stone tools. The tools were simple. Flakes of rock struck against each other to produce a sharp edge, a cutting surface, a scraper. But they were tools. Deliberately made, deliberately used, found repeatedly in association with the same kind of animal. The researchers named this species habilis, skillful, handy, because the implication seemed clear. This was the maker. Homo habilis was not impressive by any modern standard. Its brain was larger than its predecessors among the Australopithecines, the pre-human hominids that preceded the genus Homo, but still small by any subsequent human measure. Between 500 and 800 cubic centimeters, compared to the modern human average of approximately 1,400 cubic centimeters. Its face was still ape-like in many respects, a projecting jaw, a low forehead, heavy brow ridges. Its arms were long relative to its body, still suggesting a life spent partly in trees. It was small, perhaps 1 to 1.5 meters tall, perhaps 30 to 37 kilograms. Nothing about it screamed apex predator. Nothing about it suggested that its lineage would eventually produce an animal capable of traveling to the moon. And yet, the tools changed everything. Because a stone tool is not merely a stone. A stone tool is an idea made physical. It requires the conceptual leap of understanding that one object can be used to modify another object, that the natural world contains materials that can be shaped to purpose. That effort invested now produces capability later. Every stone tool is a tiny crystallization of abstract thought, and Homo habilis was making them 2.5 million years ago, in a world of predators larger and faster and stronger than anything it could fight with its bare hands. But Homo habilis was not alone in the early Pleistocene. Running alongside it, and for a long time overlooked, was another species so similar that researchers argued for decades about whether it was the same animal or a different one. Homo rudolfensis, named for the lake, now called Lake Turkana in Kenya, where its skull was first recovered. Homo rudolfensis had a larger brain than habilis, perhaps 700 to 800 cubic centimeters, and a flatter, broader face. But it is still unclear whether rudolfensis was genuinely a separate species or simply a variant of habilis. The argument continues in the scientific literature to this day. What is certain is that the early Pleistocene landscape of eastern Africa contained at least 2 distinct populations of tool-making, upright walking hominids competing for space and resources, and that both eventually disappeared without leaving direct descendants in the modern human lineage. They were the opening act, the experiments that established what the genus Homo could be, and demonstrated that being Homo was no guarantee of survival. The species that changed the game entirely appeared approximately 2 million years ago. And it changed the game not by being smarter, not by being more culturally sophisticated, not by developing more complex social structures, but by moving. Homo erectus, the upright man. The name is slightly misleading. Habilis walked upright too, as did rudolfensis. But the name reflects the historical moment of discovery, when 19th century researchers first encountered this animal's fossils in Java and recognized, with some shock, that they were looking at something unmistakably human in its posture and locomotion. Homo erectus stood fully upright. It walked with a gait mechanically similar to our own. Its legs were long, longer in proportion to its arms than any previous hominin, closing the anatomical gap between the tree-climbing apes and the ground-dwelling humans. And its brain was substantially larger than anything that had preceded it, ranging from roughly 750 cubic centimeters in the earliest specimens to over 1,100 cubic centimeters in the latest. A brain expansion that tracked over nearly 2 million years of continuous evolution. 2 million years. Let that number sit for a moment. Homo erectus existed as a recognizable species for approximately 2 million years. From roughly 2 million years ago to perhaps 100,000 years ago in some populations, and possibly as recently as 40,000 years ago in isolated populations in Java. For comparison, Homo sapiens has existed for approximately 300,000 years. We have been modern humans for less than 1/6 of the time that Homo erectus walked the earth. If Homo erectus were here to comment on our species, it would be entitled to point out that we are the newcomers, the experiment still in progress, the species that has not yet demonstrated the staying power it achieved. And Homo erectus moved. It was the first hominin to leave Africa. The oldest Homo erectus fossils outside Africa come from Dmanisi in Georgia. Ancient Georgia, in the Caucasus, not the American state, dated to approximately 1.8 million years ago. This means that within 200,000 years of first appearing in Africa, Homo erectus had walked overland to the edge of Europe. Within a few 100,000 more years, it had reached what is now China. Within another few 100,000, it had crossed the narrow sea channel to the island of Java in Indonesia, a crossing that required either intentional boat travel or the exploitation of a land bridge exposed during glacial periods of lower sea level. The picture of Homo erectus that emerges from the fossil record across its enormous geographic range and its 2 million year temporal range is not a picture of a single uniform animal. It is a picture of a highly variable, highly adaptable creature that was simultaneously solving the problems of tropical African savanna, temperate European forest, arid Central Asian steppe, subtropical Chinese woodland, and tropical Indonesian jungle. Different populations of Homo erectus evolved different body proportions, different skull shapes, different tool traditions. Some populations used fire. There is evidence of controlled fire use at Homo erectus sites dating to approximately 1 million years ago at Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, and to somewhat later dates at sites in China and Europe. Some populations appear to have hunted large game cooperatively. Some populations showed evidence of caring for injured and elderly individuals. A Homo erectus skull from Dmanisi shows an individual who had lost all of its teeth long before death, meaning it had survived for years in a toothless state, which in a world of raw meat and hard plant foods required either the assistance of others or a remarkably sophisticated ability to process food with other tools. And then Homo erectus was gone. Not suddenly. Its disappearance was not a catastrophe, but a gradual fade, population by population, as other Homo species expanded, as climates shifted, as the particular combination of adaptations that made erectus so successful across so many environments apparently proved insufficient against the competition that eventually arrived. The last populations in Java may have survived until 40,000 years ago, meaning Homo erectus and Homo sapiens were almost certainly contemporaries for a significant period. What happened when they met is unknown. The fossil record offers no clear answer, but the outcome is not ambiguous. Now we arrive at the species that haunts the middle of the human story. The species that, had history bent differently, might have been us, Homo heidelbergensis. Named for the German city near which its first remains were discovered in 1907, a single lower jaw found in a sandpit near Mauer. Homo heidelbergensis lived from approximately 700,000 years ago to approximately 200,000 years ago. It was, by every measurable criterion, a highly sophisticated animal. Its brain was large, overlapping with the modern human range, between 1,100 and 1,400 cubic centimeters in many specimens. It made wooden spears. The Schöningen spears, discovered in Germany, are approximately 300,000 years old, meticulously crafted from spruce wood, aerodynamically balanced in a way that modern testing has confirmed would have made them effective throwing weapons at ranges of several tens of meters. It hunted horses and rhinoceroses and giant deer. It built shelters. It was, in all likelihood, capable of some form of language. Not necessarily language as complex as ours, but the anatomical structures associated with speech production were present. And Homo heidelbergensis was the ancestor, or at least the closest relative, of both the Neanderthals and of Homo sapiens. Approximately 400,000 years ago, a population of Homo heidelbergensis in Africa began diverging toward what would eventually become our own species. Simultaneously, or slightly earlier, a population in Europe and Western Asia began diverging toward what would eventually become the Neanderthals. The two lineages separated, the African branch slowly becoming more gracile, more cognitively flexible, developing the anatomical and neural architecture of modern human intelligence. The European branch developing into the Neanderthals, stocky, cold-adapted, enormously strong, with brains as large as ours or larger, and a cultural sophistication that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The Neanderthals deserve their own sustained attention because they are the most studied of our extinct relatives, and the one whose story most directly intersects with our own. Homo neanderthalensis, named for the Neander Valley in Germany, where their first recognized fossils were discovered in 1856, lived from approximately 400,000 years ago to approximately 40,000 years ago. They were not the brutish, hunched, dim-witted cave dwellers of popular imagination. That image, which took root in 19th century reconstructions and proved remarkably persistent in popular culture, despite being comprehensively demolished by the science, was based on a single skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France that turned out to belong to an elderly individual with severe arthritis, whose stooped posture was pathological, not typical. The real Neanderthal stood fully upright, was physically similar to a modern human of robust build, and had a brain that was on average slightly larger than the modern human brain, approximately 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. What the Neanderthals did with that brain is a question that has consumed paleoanthropologists for decades, and the answers keep changing. We know they made stone tools. The Mysterian tool industry, associated with Neanderthals across their European and Western Asian range, was a sophisticated technology involving the careful preparation of a stone core before striking off a tool flake, a technique called the Levallois method that required planning, visual spatial reasoning, and significant manual skill. We know they controlled fire. Neanderthal hearths are found throughout their range, and the evidence for deliberate fire-making, rather than the opportunistic use of naturally occurring fire, grows stronger with each new site analysis. We know they buried their dead, At several sites, including Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Ferrassier in France, Neanderthal bodies were placed in deliberate positions in apparent graves, sometimes with associated objects that may represent grave goods. We know they cared for their injured and sick. The Shanidar, one individual, an adult male found in Iraq in the 1950s, shows evidence of multiple severe injuries accumulated over a lifetime. A withered right arm, likely amputated or paralyzed from the shoulder, a damaged eye socket suggesting vision loss, a healed fracture to the skull, severe arthritis throughout the skeleton. This individual survived these injuries for years, which in the Neanderthal world was only possible with the assistance of others. Someone fed him when he could not hunt. Someone sheltered him when he could not build. This is not the behavior of a dim animal. This is the behavior of a social species capable of empathy, capable of recognizing that the group benefits from maintaining its members even when those members cannot contribute to immediate survival. We know, and this is the discovery that most fundamentally changed how we understand the Neanderthals, that they interbred with Homo sapiens. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, first achieved by Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and recognized with the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, revealed that between 1% and 4% of the genome of all living humans outside Africa is Neanderthal in origin. Every person of European, Asian, or indigenous American ancestry carries Neanderthal DNA. The genes that Neanderthals contributed include variants associated with immune function, helping modern humans resist pathogens encountered in new environments as they expanded out of Africa, and variants associated with skin and hair characteristics suited to higher latitude, lower sunlight environments. The Neanderthals did not simply disappear. They were partially absorbed, but only partially. Their species ended. And the question of why? Why a species with a brain as large as ours, with fire, with tools, with language, with social complexity, with 40,000 years of accumulated cultural knowledge about the European environment, why that species could not survive the arrival of Homo sapiens into its territory, is one of the most debated questions in paleoanthropology. The competing hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. Climate change was underway. The period between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago saw significant fluctuations in European climate, and the Neanderthal population was probably already stressed and fragmented. Competition with Homo sapiens for food resources, particularly the large game that both species depended on, would have amplified this stress. Direct violence between the two species cannot be ruled out and may have been significant. And demographic mathematics is brutal. If Homo sapiens had even a small reproductive or survival advantage over Neanderthals, if slightly more sapiens children survived to reproduce, if sapiens bands could support slightly larger populations in a given territory, then over a period of thousands of generations, the arithmetic of population dynamics grinds inexorably toward one outcome. The Neanderthals did not need to be massacred. They simply needed to be slightly outcompeted for long enough by a species that was slightly better at something crucial: What that something was remains genuinely uncertain. Some researchers point to symbolic cognition, the ability to create and communicate through abstract symbols, which may have made Homo sapiens' social networks larger, more flexible, and more capable of transmitting useful information across distance and time. Some point to projectile technology. The spear thrower and eventually the bow allowed sapiens hunters to kill from a distance, reducing the physical risk of hunting large dangerous animals and making us more efficient predators. Some point to network size. Homo sapiens appears to have maintained trade and exchange networks across much larger geographic areas than Neanderthals, allowing for the flow of materials, genes, and ideas across hundreds of kilometers in ways that gave any local population access to resources from distant regions. Whatever the advantage, it was enough. 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were present across Europe and Western Asia. 30,000 years ago, they were gone. Now we turn to the species that was, until very recently, the most unknown human in the family. A species discovered not through fossils, but through genetics alone. A species that, when first identified, had no face, no skeleton, no archaeology, only a fragment of genetic sequence extracted from a tiny piece of finger bone. The Denisovans. In 2008, archaeologists excavating Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia found a small bone fragment from a finger, the distal phalanx of a young female, approximately 40,000 years old. The fragment was small enough that it would have attracted little attention in any other context. But the team, working with Svante Pääbo's laboratory, extracted ancient DNA from the fragment. What they found was extraordinary. The DNA was clearly human. It belonged to a member of the genus Homo. But it was neither Homo sapiens nor Neanderthal. It was a third group, previously entirely unknown to science, related to both Neanderthals and modern humans, but genetically distinct from either. This was the Denisovan, and the subsequent years of research have revealed that what initially appeared to be a small, geographically restricted population was in fact a vast, geographically widespread, and ecologically diverse group of humans who occupied much of Eastern and Southeastern Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence for Denisovan geographic range comes not from fossils, which remain extraordinarily scarce, but from DNA. The genomes of living populations across Asia, Australia, and the Pacific carry Denisovan-derived DNA in varying proportions. Papuans and Aboriginal Australians carry approximately 3 to 5% Denisovan DNA, the highest proportion of any living human population. Filipino Negrito populations carry the highest single population proportion, yet measured approximately 5%. Han Chinese and other East Asian populations carry approximately 0.2%. Indigenous Americans carry a Denisovan genetic legacy distinct from that in Oceanian populations, suggesting a separate interbreeding event with a different Denisovan population during the migration through Berinia. The geographic distribution of Denisovan DNA in modern populations tells a story of a species that was not a single, homogeneous population, but a collection of distinct regional populations, each adapted to different environments, each interbreeding with Homo sapiens in different times and places as our species expanded across Asia. At least 2, and possibly 3 separate interbreeding events between Homo sapiens and distinct Denisovan populations are recorded in the DNA of living people. And the Denisovan DNA that survived in modern populations was not random. It was selected for. The best documented example is EPAS1, a gene associated with regulation of hemoglobin production at high altitude. The variant of EPAS, one that allows Tibetan people to live and work at altitudes above 4,000 meters without the severe altitude sickness that incapacitates lowland humans, is a Denisovan variant, a version of the gene that Tibetan ancestors acquired through interbreeding with Denisovans, who had been living on the Tibetan plateau long enough to evolve this adaptation. Without their Denisovan ancestors, Tibetan people would be physiologically unable to inhabit one of the most extensive high-altitude regions on Earth. The Denisovans adapted to the Tibetan plateau. Their descendants, partially, live there still. In August 2025, new research confirmed that Denisovan-derived genes helped humans migrating across the Bering Strait into the Americas, specifically the MUC19 gene associated with cold adaptation and immune function, which appears to have given early Americans advantages in surviving the extreme conditions of the Beringian crossing. The Denisovans helped populate the Americas. They did it through DNA, 30,000 years after their own species ceased to exist. A high-quality genome of a 200,000-year-old Denisovan male, published in preprint form in October 2025, revealed new details about this ancient individual's biology. The population genetics of the Pleistocene human world were not the clean, separated lineages that earlier researchers assumed. They were a tangled web of repeated contact, interbreeding, and gene flow across species boundaries that we are only now beginning to map with any accuracy. We still do not know what a Denisovan looked like. We have a jaw fragment from the Xiahe cave on the Tibetan plateau, the highest altitude hominin fossil ever discovered at approximately 3,400 meters, and a few teeth and bone fragments from Denisova cave itself. The jaw is large, larger than any modern human jaw, suggesting a robustly built individual. The teeth are enormous, larger than Neanderthal teeth, larger than most Homo sapiens teeth, shaped in ways that suggest specific dietary adaptations. From the genome, researchers have reconstructed certain physical features. The Denisovans probably had dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes, similar to Neanderthals. Their skulls may have been wide and low, but the face itself remains unknown. The species that left its genetic mark on hundreds of millions of living humans is represented in the fossil record by a handful of bones and teeth that you could carry in your jacket pocket. And while we look for the Denisovan's face in the scattered record, another species was living in Africa, a species so strange, so anatomically contradictory, so chronologically unexpected that when its fossils were first announced in 2015, it forced a complete rethinking of the human family tree. Homo naledi. The announcement of Homo naledi was one of the most dramatic moments in paleoanthropology in decades. In 2013, a team of researchers led by Lee Berger of the University of the Witwatersrand were directed by cavers to a narrow chamber deep within the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, the same region, the cradle of humankind, that has produced more hominin fossils than almost anywhere else on Earth. The chamber was accessible only through a vertical shaft 18 centimeters wide at its narrowest point. The researchers who excavated it had to be specifically selected for their small body size, and they worked lying flat in spaces where there was barely room to turn their heads. What they found there was astonishing. More than 1,500 fossils, representing at least 15 individual hominins of various ages from infant to elderly, scattered across the chamber floor. The largest single-site hominin fossil found in Africa. And the anatomy of those fossils was like nothing anyone had described before. Homo naledi had a brain approximately the size of an orange, between 400 and 600 cubic centimeters, roughly half the size of a modern human brain, and comparable to the earliest members of the genus Homo from 2.5 million years ago. But its hands were shaped almost identically to modern human hands. The wrist structure, the thumb proportions, the finger morphology, all indicating a capacity for the precise tool-using grip that we associate with high cognitive function. Its feet were essentially modern. The arch, the toe proportions, the heel structure, all indicating a bipedal gait so close to ours that a Homo naledi footprint in mud might be difficult to distinguish from a modern human one. But its shoulders were rotated forward in the ape-like fashion. Its fingers were curved in a way suggesting significant time spent climbing, and its face, with its small brain case and projecting features, looked ancient by any standard. The anatomy was a mosaic. Ancient features and modern features combined in a single body in ways that made no sense if you assumed evolution proceeds in a straight line from primitive to advanced. Homo naledi was not a primitive ancestor on its way to becoming us. It was something else, a branch of the human family tree that had gone in a different direction, retaining some ancient characteristics while independently evolving some remarkably human-like ones. And then the dating results came back. Researchers initially assumed, given the primitive brain size, that Homo naledi was ancient, perhaps 2 million years old, perhaps more. What the dating actually showed was that the fossils from the Dinaledi chamber were between 235,000 and 335,000 years old. Homo naledi, with its tiny brain and mosaic anatomy, was walking around in southern Africa at the same time that Homo sapiens was first appearing, at the same time that the large-brained Neanderthals were flourishing in Europe, at the same time that Denisovans were ranging across Asia. The world at that moment was not progressing toward a single human species. It was a simultaneous experiment in multiple directions at once. And then the controversy deepened further. In 2023, Lee Berger and colleagues announced that they had found evidence in an adjacent chamber, the hill antelope chamber of what appeared to be intentional burial by Homo naledi. Bodies placed in graves, marks on the walls that appeared to be deliberate engravings. If confirmed, this would mean that a species with a brain less than half the size of ours was engaging in symbolic behavior, was creating meaning around death, was marking its world with deliberate signs, in direct contradiction of the long-held assumption that symbolic cognition requires a brain of modern human scale. The announcement was immediately controversial. Other researchers examined the evidence and argued that the burial and engraving claims were not adequately supported, that the body positions could be explained by natural processes, that the wall marks could be natural formations. The debate is ongoing. The evidence is contested, but the question it raises cannot be easily dismissed. If Homo naledi was doing something like this with a brain the size of an orange, what does that tell us about the relationship between brain size and cognitive capacity? What does it tell us about the nature of intelligence itself? What it tells us, at minimum, is that we have been wrong before about which species were capable of what, and that the story of human cognition is considerably more complicated than the simple narrative of bigger brain equals smarter animal. The island branches of the human family tree represent perhaps the most extreme and most poignant examples of what happens when human populations are cut off from the mainland of evolutionary history and left to develop in isolation. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, was discovered in 2003 on the Indonesian island of Flores. The remains, recovered from Liang Bua cave, dated to between approximately 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. The animal they described was tiny, approximately 1 meter tall, approximately 25 to 30 kilograms, with a brain of approximately 400 cubic centimeters, even smaller than Homo naledi's. Yet Homo floresiensis used stone tools, hunted the dwarf elephants that also inhabited Flores, and controlled fire. It had been living on Flores for possibly hundreds of thousands of years before its disappearance, which coincided, probably not coincidentally, with the arrival of Homo sapiens in island Southeast Asia. The small size of Homo floresiensis is explained by insular dwarfism, the well-documented evolutionary phenomenon by which large animals isolated on islands with limited resources tend to evolve smaller body size over generations, as smaller individuals require less food and reproduce more efficiently in resource-limited environments. The same phenomenon produced the dwarf elephants that Homo floresiensis hunted. The island was a laboratory that ran evolution backward in terms of body size, while apparently maintaining enough cognitive capacity for tool use and cooperative hunting. And then, in 2019, a second island dwarf human was announced. Homo luzonensis, from Luzon in the Philippines, known from a handful of teeth and foot and hand bones, discovered in Calao cave and dated to approximately 50,000 to 67,000 years ago. The foot bone morphology of Homo luzonensis is primitive. It shares features with Australopithecus, the pre-human hominin of 3 million years ago, yet the teeth are smaller and more derived. The species represents yet another independent evolution of human characteristics on an isolated island, another branch of the genus Homo, developing in parallel isolation from the mainland story. Both island species are gone. Both disappearances correlate within the resolution of the dating methods available with the arrival of modern humans. Whether that arrival was causal, through direct violence, through competition for resources, through the introduction of diseases to which the island populations had no immunity, is unknown. The pattern is consistent. The interpretation is contested. By 50,000 years ago, the count of surviving human species outside of Homo sapiens was rapidly declining. Homo erectus was in its final populations in Java. The Neanderthals were entering their last few thousand years in Europe. The Denisovans were fading from the fossil and genetic record. Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis were gone, or nearly so. And Homo sapiens was everywhere, expanding into Europe, moving through Asia, crossing into Australia, eventually crossing Beringia into the Americas. The question that remains, the question that may be the most important and most honest question in the entire study of human evolution, is why? Why us? Not why did the others go extinct. We have partial answers to that, involving climate and competition and demographics. But why did we survive when they did not? What did Homo sapiens have that Homo heidelbergensis, with its comparable brain size, its hunting skill, its fire and its wooden spears, lacked? What did we have that the Neanderthals, with their empathy and their burials and their arguably larger brains, lacked? What advantage was sufficient to produce the outcome of the past 40,000 years? One species, one planet, no competition. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, but the evidence points in several directions simultaneously. The first is network size. Homo sapiens, wherever we find evidence of our earliest populations outside Africa, appears to have maintained exchange networks of extraordinary geographic extent, moving raw materials, finished tools, and almost certainly information across hundreds, and in some cases thousands of kilometers. An obsidian blade found at a site in Kenya was transported from a source over 300 kilometers away. Marine shells used as personal ornaments are found at inland sites far from any ocean. This kind of long-distance exchange implies social connections between groups that had never met face-to-face, implies some system of obligation, reputation, and trust that extended beyond immediate kin and local band. This kind of extended social network means that information about resources, about dangers, about innovations in technology or strategy could spread rapidly across large geographic areas. A good idea invented in one location could reach a population 1,000 kilometers away within a generation. The second is symbolic cognition, the capacity to create, manipulate, and communicate through abstract symbols. The behavioral modernity revolution in the archaeological record, the explosion of personal ornaments, pigment use, geometric engravings, and eventually figurative art, appears earlier in Homo sapiens than in any other species, and at a scale and complexity unmatched. Whether this reflects a genuine cognitive difference between us and the Neanderthals, or whether it reflects sampling bias in an incomplete fossil record, is debated. But the scale of symbolic behavior in Homo sapiens populations is qualitatively different from anything documented for our extinct relatives. And symbolic cognition matters because it allows information to be stored outside the individual brain, in a carved bone, in a cave painting, in a shared myth, making knowledge cumulative in ways that biological memory alone cannot achieve. The third, and perhaps most counterintuitive, is sex. Homo sapiens did not simply replace its competitors. It absorbed them. The evidence from ancient DNA is unambiguous. Every living human outside Africa carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Many populations in Asia carry Denisovan DNA. There is evidence in the genomes of some African populations for interbreeding with one or more unknown archaic human populations, ghost lineages that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. We were not a conquering army that exterminated what came before us. We were a highly social, highly promiscuous species that interbred with every related form we encountered, incorporating their adaptations, their immune genes, their cold weather physiology, their high altitude capabilities, into our own gene pool. This is perhaps the deepest irony of human evolutionary history. The species that survived is not the one with the best individual adaptations. It is the one that was best at stealing adaptations from others. The Homo sapiens immune system is partly Neanderthal. The Tibetan capacity for high-altitude life is Denisovan. The Bering Strait crossing that populated the Americas was assisted by Denisovan cold adaptation genes. We are not a pure product of a single evolutionary lineage. We are a composite, a mosaic of contributions from every species we ever met and mated with. The losers of evolutionary history live inside the winner. They always have. This realization changes something fundamental about how we understand ourselves. The narrative of human uniqueness, the story that Homo sapiens is special, is categorically different from everything that came before, is the inevitable culmination of an evolutionary process aimed at producing us, is not supported by what we actually find. What we find is 9 species, each with significant capabilities, each adapted to its environment, each running its experiment in being human. 8 of them ended. 1 survived, partly through its own capabilities, partly through circumstances, partly through the accumulated genetic inheritance of those it replaced. We are 40,000 years into our monopoly on humanity. By the standards of Homo erectus, which ran its experiment for 2 million years, we are barely getting started. The question of whether Homo sapiens is the most durable experiment the genus Homo has ever produced, or simply the most recent, will not be answered in our lifetimes. What we can say with confidence is this: the world that produced us was not a world with 1 story. It was a world with 9 stories running simultaneously. 8 of those stories ended. But they did not end without leaving something behind. They left it in our blood, in our immune systems, in our capacity to breathe thin air on the roof of the world, in our ability to survive the crossing of a frozen land bridge into an empty continent. The 8 species who did not become us, they are still here. They are reading these words. They are watching this video. They are, in the most literal biological sense, part of the species that survived. We are not the last humans, because we were the best humans. We are the last humans because we were the most human, the most capable of recognizing others like us, of connecting with them, of taking what they had and making it our own. And somewhere in that fact, if you look at it long enough, is something that feels almost like a debt. Let us return to Homo heidelbergensis, because this species deserves more than a paragraph. It deserves the kind of sustained attention we give to the Neanderthals, because in many respects, it was more consequential than the Neanderthals and less understood. 700,000 years ago. That is when Homo heidelbergensis appears in the fossil record with clarity, though its origins stretch back further into the murky transition from Homo erectus that paleoanthropologists have been arguing about for over a century. 700,000 years ago, Europe was a cold, hostile, ecologically demanding environment. The glacial cycles of the Pleistocene were intensifying. Warm interglacial periods, alternating with ice ages in which the ice sheets of northern Europe extended as far south as what is now Germany and England, in which average temperatures dropped by 8 to 12 degrees Celsius, in which the megafauna of the continent, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave bear, the straight-tusked elephant, the giant deer with its 3-meter antler span, moved south or died. Into this environment came Homo heidelbergensis, and it did not merely survive, it thrived. The Boxgrove site in West Sussex, England, is one of the most important Homo heidelbergensis sites in Europe. Dated to approximately 500,000 years ago, it preserves an extraordinarily detailed record of heidelbergensis life on what was then the shoreline of a shallow coastal lagoon. The bones of horses, rhinoceroses, and large deer are present in abundance, and they are not the bones of animals that died naturally. They are the bones of animals that were butchered, systematically, skillfully, in a way that indicates coordinated hunting by groups capable of taking down prey many times their individual size. The stone tools found at Boxgrove are among the finest hand axes ever recovered from anywhere in the world. Symmetrical, carefully shaped, produced through a sequence of controlled strikes that required both technical knowledge and fine motor control. And among the faunal remains at Boxgrove is a human shin bone, Homo heidelbergensis, with cut marks on its surface. Something ate this individual. Whether that was another predator or members of its own species is unknown. The Schöningen spears, discovered in a lignite mine in Lower Saxony in Germany in the 1990s, are perhaps the most remarkable artifacts from any extinct human species. 8 spears, made from the trunks of young spruce trees, preserved in waterlogged sediment for approximately 300,000 years. They range from 1.8 to 2.5 meters in length. They are shaped, not simply sharpened sticks, but carefully crafted throwing weapons, with their maximum diameter and weight positioned at approximately the same relative location as in a modern athletic javelin, which is where engineering calculations indicate the optimal center of mass for a throwing spear should be. These are not prodding sticks or thrusting spears. They are projectile weapons, designed to be thrown with accuracy and force at targets at a distance. Their makers understood the physics of throwing, even if they could not have articulated that understanding in language. Around the spears were the bones of more than 20 horses, with clear butchery marks. Homo heidelbergensis was not a marginal scavenger. It was an apex predator, killing large game with purpose-built ranged weapons in a coordinated group effort in an Ice Age European environment that would have challenged any tropical primate to its limits of endurance. And Homo heidelbergensis built shelters. At Terra Amata, near Nice in France, there is evidence of constructed shelters dating to approximately 380,000 years ago. Oval structures built from branches, anchored by stones, with hearths inside. The evidence is debated, as evidence from this period almost always is. But it represents our best current indication that Homo heidelbergensis was not simply exploiting natural caves, but actively constructing its own sheltered environments, modifying the landscape rather than merely inhabiting it. Why did this species end? The research suggests climate. As Homo heidelbergensis existed through the late Middle Pleistocene, the glacial cycles became more severe. The species had evolved in a climate context and had a climatic niche, a range of temperature and environmental conditions within which it could survive and reproduce efficiently. Statistical modeling of the relationship between Homo heidelbergensis fossil sites and the climatic conditions at the time those sites were occupied shows that in the period immediately before its disappearance from the fossil record, the climatic niche of the species shrank dramatically. The conditions it was adapted to became rarer. The environments it could inhabit contracted. And as the African branch of its lineage was transforming into Homo sapiens, the heidelbergensis populations themselves, already under climatic stress, found themselves competing with both their descendant species and with the Neanderthals, the other descendant lineage. They were replaced from two directions simultaneously by the very species they had produced. There is something almost classical about this. The parent species devoured by its own children. Now let us talk about what happened when Homo sapiens first walked out of Africa and into a world already occupied by other humans. Because the conventional narrative, anatomically modern humans emerge, spread rapidly, and replace archaic populations through superior intelligence and technology, is almost certainly wrong in its details, and possibly wrong in its fundamentals. The most recent evidence suggests that Homo sapiens did not emerge from Africa in a single migration wave, but in multiple pulses over a period of perhaps 100,000 years. The oldest confirmed Homo sapiens fossils outside Africa come from Mislia Cave in Israel, dated to approximately 177,000 years ago. meaning our species was present in the Levant almost 200,000 years ago, long before the main out-of-Africa expansion that populated the rest of the world. These early migrants did not leave a detectable genetic legacy in any living population. They appear to have died out or been absorbed without trace. They were a false start, a population that reached the edge of Africa and then disappeared. The migration that actually populated the world appears to have begun approximately 70,000 years ago, possibly triggered by a genetic or cultural change in the African sapiens population that made them more capable of sustained long-distance expansion. This is the wave whose descendants we are. And as this wave moved through the Middle East, into Central Asia, into Europe, into Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia, it encountered every other surviving human species. The encounters were not uniform. The evidence from genetics suggests that in each case there was interbreeding, but the amount of interbreeding varied dramatically. Neanderthals contributed 1 to 4% of the genome of non-African modern humans, concentrated in particular genomic regions, suggesting that some Neanderthal genes were actively beneficial and selected for, while others may have been selected against, reducing Neanderthal contributions in regions of the genome associated with male fertility and cognitive function. The Denisovans contributed more to some populations, up to 5% in Papuans, and less to others. The unknown African archaic populations contributed to some sub-Saharan African populations. In each case, the pattern suggests selective assimilation rather than random mixing. Our ancestors took what was useful from the species they encountered and let the rest fade. This is not how we usually think about species replacement. The standard model, competition, displacement, extinction, is real, but it was not the whole story. The whole story includes a significant component of genetic annexation. We did not just beat the other species, we incorporated them. Consider what this means for understanding modern human variation. The people of Tibet who live and work at 4,000 meters altitude, whose hemoglobin regulation allows them to function in oxygen concentrations that would incapacitate a lowland person, are carrying a Denisovan gene variant that may have taken those ancient Denisovans thousands of generations to evolve on the Tibetan plateau. The Tibetans did not evolve this capability independently. They inherited it from a species that no longer exists, through an act of interbreeding that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. They are, in a very direct sense, beneficiaries of Denisovan evolution. The Denisovans solved the problem of high altitude. The Tibetans inherited the solution. Similarly, the immune gene variants inherited from Neanderthals, particularly variants of the HLA genes, which encode the proteins that allow the immune system to recognize pathogens, gave early Homo sapiens populations moving into Europe and Asia access to immune responses that Neanderthals had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of exposure to the pathogens of those environments. Our ancestors arrived in Europe as immunological strangers, encountering diseases to which they had no prior exposure. The Neanderthal genes they acquired, through interbreeding with the population they were in the process of replacing, helped them survive those diseases. There is a dark irony here that is difficult to ignore. The Neanderthals may have contributed to their own replacement by making the population replacing them more resistant to the diseases of the environment the Neanderthals were being displaced from. The question of direct violence, of whether Homo sapiens actively killed Neanderthals, Denisovans, or the other species they encountered, is one that the fossil record cannot definitively answer. There is no Neanderthal skeleton with a Homo sapiens spear point embedded in it, no clear forensic evidence of interspecies violence. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Modern humans are the only species in the history of life on Earth known to have deliberately driven other species to extinction through hunting. The megafauna extinctions that followed Homo sapiens' expansion into Australia, the Americas, and other regions are the clearest documented cases. It would be remarkable if a species capable of systematically eliminating the mammoths and mastodons, the giant ground sloths and cave lions, was incapable of applying similar pressure to competing human species, when those species occupied the same territories and competed for the same resources. The truth is probably that the replacement of archaic human species by Homo sapiens was messy, variable, and involved all of the above mechanisms simultaneously: interbreeding, competition, climate stress, direct conflict, and demographic pressure, in proportions that varied by location and time period. There was no single event, no final battle, no moment when the last Neanderthal died and Homo sapiens claimed victory. There was a long, grinding process of demographic attrition that played out over thousands of years across a continent, and at its end, one species remained. What strikes me, and I want to be direct about this as the person behind this channel, as someone who has spent considerable time thinking about these questions, is not the triumph but the loss. We are accustomed to telling this story as a success story. Homo sapiens wins. Modern humans emerge. We are here. But consider what was lost in the process. Neanderthals had 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the European environment. They knew which plants were medicinal and which were toxic. They knew the migration patterns of the animals they hunted. They knew the locations of water sources, of shelter, of the stone outcrops from which the best tool-making flint could be extracted. They had a relationship with their landscape built over hundreds of generations that we can barely imagine. And all of that knowledge died with them. We inherited their genes. We did not inherit their knowledge. The Denisovans, spread across the vast territory from Siberia to the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, had adapted to environments of extraordinary variety. They had solved problems of high altitude, of tropical disease, of the specific ecological challenges of every environment they inhabited. They had done so over hundreds of thousands of years, through the slow accumulation of both genetic and cultural knowledge. The genetic inheritance we received from them is documented. The cultural inheritance, the knowledge, the techniques, the accumulated wisdom about how to live in those environments is not recoverable. It vanished. Homo naledi, with its strange mosaic anatomy and its possible burial practices, raises a question that I find genuinely unsettling. What was it experiencing? Not in the sentimental sense, not as an exercise in anthropomorphism, but as a serious biological question. A species that potentially marks the deaths of its members, that places bodies in specific locations with deliberate care, is a species for which death has meaning. Meaning is cognitive. If Homo naledi had a relationship with death that resembled, even distantly, our own, if it understood in some sense that its companions had been alive and were now not, that this transition mattered, then the extinction of Homo naledi was the extinction of an experience of the world that was, in some sense, comparable to ours. Not identical, not equivalent in complexity, perhaps, but comparable in kind. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is an honest one. The last survivors of the human family outside our own species were probably the Denisovans, who may have persisted in some isolated form until as recently as 15,000 years ago in parts of island Southeast Asia. By 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was the only surviving human species over most of its range. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The world had contracted from 9 experiments to 1. And the one remaining experiment, us, had no competitors, no alternatives, no other version of humanity to check its expansion or diversify its possibilities. For the past 40,000 years, we have been alone. It is, as the evolutionary biologist Nick Longrich noted, historically weird. Not that far back, we were not special. We were one option among several. Now we are the only option, and we carry, encoded in our genomes, the faint traces of all the options we replaced. I think that matters. I think it should change how we understand ourselves, not as the inevitable product of evolution's progress toward intelligence, not as the superior species that outcompeted inferior rivals, but as the survivor of a contingent historical process that could have gone differently at many points. If the climate had shifted slightly earlier or slightly later, if a population of Neanderthals had developed a slightly more effective immune response, if the Denisovan populations had maintained a higher level of connectivity with each other, reducing their vulnerability to local extinction events, if Homo naledi had encountered a slightly different ecological context in southern Africa 250,000 years ago, at any of these junctures, the outcome could have been different. Not certainly different, but possibly. The 40,000 years of human monopoly on the planet was not written into the laws of nature. It was the outcome of a sequence of events, many of them stochastic, that happened to produce us. We are the last humans. That is an extraordinary thing to be. It is also, if you think about it honestly, a slightly lonely thing to be. We evolved in a world of human diversity, a world where being Homo sapiens meant being one kind of human among several kinds, where the genus Homo expressed itself in multiple simultaneous experiments in intelligence, culture, and adaptation. That world ended. The world we live in now, one species, one lineage, a monopoly on humanity, is not the world we evolved in. It is the aftermath of that world's end. And yet, the others are not entirely gone. They are in the genome of every Tibetan who breathes thin mountain air without effort. They are in the immune system of every European whose ancestors survived the diseases of the Ice Age. They are in the cold adaptation genes of the first Americans who crossed the Bering Land Bridge and found a continent waiting to be inhabited. The 8 species who did not make it to the present left their mark on the one that did. We are not a clean slate. We are a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over, each new writing incomplete, each new layer preserving traces of what was written before. The Neanderthals wrote on us. The Denisovans wrote on us. The unknown archaic Africans wrote on us. And somewhere in that accumulated text, in the layered history of every human genome on Earth, the story of the 8 species who almost became us is still being told. There is a detail about the Neanderthal extinction that most popular accounts omit, and it is a detail that changes the emotional texture of the story considerably. The Neanderthals did not disappear all at once. They retreated. As Homo sapiens expanded into Europe from the east, beginning approximately 45,000 years ago, the Neanderthal populations did not simply collapse. They contracted geographically, pulling back from the Eastern and Central European territories they had occupied, concentrating in the Western Refugia, the Iberian Peninsula, the Atlantic coast of France, the caves and valleys of what is now northern Spain. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites are in southern Spain, in Gorham's Cave on the Rock of Gibraltar, dated to approximately 42,000 years ago. Gibraltar, the extreme southwestern tip of Europe, surrounded on 3 sides by water, with Africa visible on a clear day across the 14 kilometers of the strait, was the last redoubt of a species that had once ranged from Portugal to the Ural Mountains, from the shores of the North Sea to the deserts of the Middle East. They held on there. For how long after Gorham's Cave is uncertain, the dating methods available have margins of error of several thousand years in either direction. But the picture is of a population contracting toward a geographical dead end, diminishing in numbers, increasingly fragmented until the fragmentation became total. The Neanderthals did not go out with a bang. They faded, like a fire burning down to its last embers in the far corner of a continent, while a new fire spread across the rest of the world. This geographical pattern, retreat to refugia, final concentration in marginal environments, eventual disappearance, is exactly what we see in other megafauna extinctions that followed Homo sapiens' expansion. Woolly mammoths on the Siberian mainland disappeared approximately 10,000 years ago. A small population survived on Wrangel Island, isolated in the Arctic Ocean, until approximately 4,000 years ago, outlasting the mainland population by 6,000 years. The pattern of island or peninsula survival is consistent. When a species is being eliminated by a combination of climate change and human pressure, the last survivors are those in the most geographically isolated, most difficult to reach locations. Gibraltar was Neanderthal Wrangel Island. The comparison with mammoths is uncomfortable but instructive. We do not generally speak of mammoth extinction as a triumph. We speak of it, in recent decades, with something closer to regret, with an acknowledgement that the loss of the mammoth impoverished the ecosystems it inhabited, that the Pleistocene world was richer for their presence, that their disappearance was a diminishment. We have begun to apply similar language to the other megafauna extinctions that followed human expansion. It has not yet become common to apply that language to the Neanderthals. Perhaps because acknowledging the loss of another human species feels more personally implicating than acknowledging the loss of a large proboscidean. But the logic is the same. The world was richer when it contained Neanderthals. Their disappearance was a diminishment, and the mechanism of their disappearance was, at least in part, us. Let us spend a moment with the Denisovan timeline, because the genetics allow us to reconstruct a story of remarkable geographic scope. The oldest Denisovan individual we have direct evidence for is the 200,000-year-old male from Denisova Cave, whose genome was published in preprint form in October 2025. This individual, living in the Altai Mountains 200,000 years ago, already carried Neanderthal DNA, evidence that Denisovans and Neanderthals had been interbreeding for long enough that this individual's genome had been significantly shaped by the contact. The Denisovans and Neanderthals were not strangers. They were, in some sense, neighbors, sharing the vast Eurasian landmass, occasionally encountering each other at its edges, occasionally producing offspring together. We have the direct fossil evidence of one such offspring. In 2018, a bone fragment from Denisova Cave was identified as belonging to an individual who was literally the first-generation offspring of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, nicknamed Denny by the researchers who analyzed the genome. Denny was at least 13 years old at death, female, and carried precisely 50% Neanderthal and 50% Denisovan DNA. She was not a curiosity or an accident. The fact that she existed at all, that a Neanderthal and a Denisovan encountered each other in or near Denisova Cave and produced a viable offspring who survived to at least early adolescence, tells us that these two species were not so genetically diverged that their offspring were infertile or unviable. They were close enough biologically that their children lived, and if their children lived, some of those children reproduced. The gene flow between Denisovans and Neanderthals was real and recurring. The Siahe mandible, the jaw fragment discovered in Baishia Karst Cave and dated to at least 160,000 years ago, tells us that Denisovans were living at extreme altitude long before any other human species is known to have done so. 160,000 years ago is extraordinarily early for a human presence at over 3,000 meters. The conditions at that altitude, low oxygen, severe cold, limited food resources, would have been deeply challenging for any population without specific physiological adaptations. The fact that the EPAS1 gene variant that Tibetan people inherited from Denisovans is so precisely adapted to high-altitude conditions suggests that the Denisovans at Siahe were not just passing through. They had been living at altitude long enough for natural selection to refine their high-altitude physiology to a remarkable degree. They had solved the problem of the roof of the world. And they solved it so well that their solution is still functioning in the bodies of Tibetan people today, tens of thousands of years after the Denisovans themselves were gone. The southernmost Denisovan presence implied by genetics in the populations of Papuans, Aboriginal Australians, and Filipino Negritos requires a Denisovan presence in Southeast Asia at a time when Homo sapiens was beginning to move through the region, approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago. This means Denisovans were simultaneously present in the Altai Mountains, at high latitude on the Tibetan Plateau at extreme altitude, and in the tropical environments of Southeast Asia at low latitude, a geographic and ecological range that rivals that of Homo erectus and surpasses that of the Neanderthals. The Denisovans were not a geographically restricted population. They were a broadly distributed species that had successfully colonized radically different environments and had, in each environment, begun adapting in ways that we are only now beginning to document through the genetic legacy they left in the populations that replaced them. The extinction of the Denisovans is even more poorly understood than the extinction of the Neanderthals. We have no clear terminal date for their disappearance. Only the absence of their DNA in unambiguous form after a certain point in the genetic record, and the silence of the fossil record beyond a handful of specimens. They were gone before 15,000 years ago. They were probably mostly gone by 40,000 years ago. Beyond that, the details are inaccessible to current methods. What we can say is that the Denisovans left a disproportionately large mark on the modern human genome relative to how much we know about them. For a species represented by a few teeth, a jaw fragment, and a handful of bone fragments from a single cave, their genetic influence on living humanity is extraordinary. Their high-altitude genes are in the bodies of millions of Tibetan people. Their immune genes may be in populations across Asia. Their cold adaptation genes crossed the Bering Strait into the Americas. A species we cannot draw, cannot reconstruct, cannot name with a face. A species we know only as a sequence of nucleotide bases extracted from ancient bone, shaped the biological capabilities of hundreds of millions of living people. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of ancient genomics, that extinction is not as complete as it appears. A species can vanish from the fossil record, can cease to exist as a reproducing population, can leave no descendants in the conventional sense, and still persist in the genomes of the species that replaced it, still influence the biology of living people 10,000 generations later, still solve problems that its successors would have struggled to solve without the genetic inheritance it left behind. The Denisovans are extinct. The Denisovans are also, in a real biological sense, still here. The contradiction is genuine, and it is one of the stranger truths that the genomic revolution in paleoanthropology has revealed. I want to return, before we close, to Homo naledi, because I think this species poses the most challenging questions of all. And I think those questions deserve to be stated clearly rather than softened. The debate about whether Homo naledi buried its dead and created engravings is unresolved. The scientists who made the claims are serious researchers with access to the original material. The scientists who contested the claims are equally serious researchers with equally valid methodological concerns. The evidence will continue to be evaluated, and the question may eventually be resolved, or it may remain contested indefinitely, as many questions in paleoanthropology do. But here is what is not contested. Homo naledi existed in southern Africa between 235,000 and 335,000 years ago, with a brain that was roughly 1/3 the volume of a modern human brain, in an environment that also contained early Homo sapiens. The two species were contemporaries. They were in the same geographic region. Whether they ever encountered each other, and if so, what those encounters looked like, is unknown. Whether Homo sapiens contributed to the extinction of Homo naledi is unknown. What we know is that Homo naledi is gone, and we are here, and the two facts are separated by a gap of time short enough that the possibility of a connection cannot be dismissed. We may have met Homo naledi. We may have been the last thing it met. We simply do not know. The 9 species of the genus Homo represent, collectively, approximately 2.5 million years of evolutionary experimentation in a single genus. They represent the full range of what it means to be human. From the small-brained, small-bodied earliest members of the lineage to the large-brained, culturally complex species at the lineage's end. They inhabited every major environment on Earth from the tropics to the subarctic. They made tools, controlled fire, built shelters, cared for their injured, buried their dead, and in at least some cases created art. They were, each of them, a genuine solution to the problem of being a highly social primate in a world of predators and competitors and unpredictable climates. 8 of those solutions are gone. 1 remains, and the one that remains carries within it, in its genome, in its immune system, in its physiological adaptations to altitude and cold, fragments of the solutions that did not survive. The next time you are at altitude and breathing easily, the next time your immune system defeats a pathogen that would have been devastating to your ancestors before they carried Neanderthal immune genes, the next time you consider what it means to be human, consider that you are not the answer to that question. You are the latest draft of an answer that has been revised over 2.5 million years by 8 other species who did not live to see the final version. They were almost us. In the ways that matter most, they still are.